And in the green feature, going green this afternoon, we're going to be talking about roadkill. Now, you may remember a few weeks ago, Jenny spoke to some guy in the UK who's been surviving off roadkill for ages. He collects these dead animals and eats them up. But it goes a lot deeper than that. And in the studio with me today for our Going Green feature, we've got Dr. Harriet Davies-Mostert, who's the head of science and research at the Endangered Wildlife Trust. And she is talking about roadkill research and the mitigation project. So it's going to be a fascinating topic, and we're going to take your calls as well on 8830-702. Your SMSs, keep them coming in, please, 31702. And you can send me a tweet as well at Aki Anastasiou is my Twitter handle. And let us know about your experiences, because I'm very, very passionate about this topic, and it's something that we should all take very seriously, and conservation is something that we should be taking very seriously. But today specifically, we're talking about roadkill. Dr. Harriet Davies-Mostert, good afternoon and welcome. Nice to have you in the studio with us.
Good afternoon, Aki.
Now, just for the listeners that are listening to us right now, we're starting to talk about roadkill. What is the definition of roadkill?
Well, I suppose in its simplest form, the roadkill is anything that gets hit by a vehicle on either a paved or unpaved road. And it is a very serious threat to biodiversity across the world.
Why is it such a big threat?
Well, as you know, roads carve up a landscape, and there are, there's, as I think you mentioned earlier, there are over 700,000 kilometres of road just in South Africa alone. And when they go through habitat that wildlife lives in, there's inevitably conflict between the wildlife and the vehicles. And obviously there's also threats to people from this. Roadkill, we're talking about wildlife roadkill, but there's obviously a very important human element here.
Yes, no, absolutely. It's quite an interesting one, because you kind of think to yourself, but animals stay away from roads, they stay away from noises and that sort of thing. And it's a fine line, because I was shocked as well to discover that we've got, over 700,000 kilometers of road in South Africa alone. And we're just basically taking over the terrain and the domain that these animals have been living in for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's obviously having an impact on wildlife. Now, this research that you've done, you've actually conducted this intense research into roadkill. How many animals are getting knocked down? How difficult has it been, firstly, to do this kind of research? Because when you knock an animal down, you don't report it.
Yeah, Aki, it's an interesting question. I think, the work that we've been doing up in northern Limpopo is just very much the tip of the iceberg in terms of trying to get an understanding of what's happening on our roads. I think you'll understand, there are two ways that roads can have impacts, and the one is directly by a vehicle hitting an animal, but then also this fragmentation that happens when roads carve up the landscape, as you've mentioned. And about 2 years ago, we started wondering what kind of impacts this had, and we were looking particularly at the direct form of mortality, so when animals get hit. And we started wondering about this, and particularly up in the northern part of Limpopo, where there is you'll be aware, the Mapungubwe National Park.
Yes.
And it's quite a topical area at the moment with the proposed coal mining there. And so we realized that there were animals that were getting hit on the road, and I think what triggered it was when a couple of African wild dogs, which are endangered, were hit by trucks. And it sort of sparked something to say, really what is the impact of this? And obviously we can't do research on 700,000 kilometres of road, but we thought this would be a good place to start to try and refine our methodology. And so Wendy Collinson, who is the project coordinator, she started doing a master's degree, and she's been doing a lot of intensive research for the last 2 years up there.
Okay, so it's interesting because I'm trying to understand statistically how you get these kind of figures, because this kind of research, if we compare South Africa to other countries around the world, I was reading some of my notes earlier, is that we really are far behind in research. I mean, you've got North America and many European countries that have been doing this kind of research for decades, and their information and their statistics are very accurate, aren't they?
Well, I wonder, how accurate they really are, because this is quite tricky information to gather. because animals get hit on the road, but then they also get scavenged and they get removed by people. And so even when you're doing quite intensive work, it's quite difficult to understand actually what the impacts are. But you're right, in North America, they have over 700 cars per 1,000 people there. We only have 130 or so.
Yes.
And so we haven't needed to really think about this as much as they have with their highways and the amount of vehicle traffic, which we know is a very important driver of this impact. But South Africa, amongst African nations, is we drive a lot of vehicles here, and we have a huge road network compared to other countries, and also because the roads are tarred, and so the speed is greater. I think we're sort of driving the new sort of cusp in terms of research around roads in this part of the world.
Does this include sand roads as well?
Yes, it does. Certainly Wendy's preliminary data suggests that sand roads are not as much of an impact as the tar roads, because obviously vehicles are moving much more slowly, and you can usually detect an animal before you hit it. But yes, we need to think about the impacts of both kinds of roads.
We welcome your calls as well. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask on this roadkill research and mitigation project that we're talking to Dr. Harriet Davies Mostert on the line, in the studio with us. She's the head of science and research at the Endangered Wildlife Trust. It's a fascinating topic, and if anything, it's something that we all need to be passionate about, and protecting our environment, our biodiversity, and these animals that are getting knocked down. Your research, it excludes dogs, obviously. We're talking about wild animals, or are you talking about any kind of animal?
No, certainly at the moment we're focusing on biodiversity, and that wouldn't include domestic animals or sheep or cattle. We haven't taken it that far yet. But there are plans to expand this program to potentially develop what we would call a transport and wildlife program, which would bring in our existing work on airports and perhaps some of the train collisions that we are hearing reports of as well, into something that would also look at that risk element associated with, say, livestock and things like that.
Yeah, it's a difficult one to track. Andy's in Boksburg, and he says he's seen, I can't believe this, Andy, is it 18 animals?
They have, to date, in the last several months now, that they've taken down the game fence on either side of the Ruster-Winter tar road. The whole idea was they were supposed to put speed humps up to slow down the motorists, and to date about 18 animals have been killed, including 8 or 9 kudu, a couple of impala, a monkey, some bush pig, some warthog. And very tragically, very recently, one of our rhino bulls was killed by a truck.
Oh, no. That's terrible. That's terrible, Andy. But that's a very, very high number, Andy. And this is the Dinokeng Game Reserve you're talking about. Where exactly is the Dinokeng Game Reserve?
They call it the Dinokeng Big Five Game Reserve. It's north of Pretoria, sort of in the Hammanskraal area.
Okay. Andy, thank you for sharing that with us. Charles in Midvaal, Charles has disappeared. But that, kind of highlights exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, Andy raises a very important point. I think some of the early work that Wendy has done has shown that, and I think work elsewhere in the world has shown that fencing is a very good mitigation measure for reducing vehicle collisions with wildlife, because obviously animals tend not to move across when there are effective fences. Yeah. One of the problems with that is that by putting up these really impermeable fences, you're sort of carving up the landscape more, so the indirect effects can be quite problematic. But we know lots of places around South Africa where there are huge wildlife collision problems. I mean, a good example that many people are aware of is the corridor road that runs between Shihlui and Mfolozi game reserves in northern KZN. And certainly we know of rhino that have been hit there. We know of wild dogs that have been hit on that road. And this is all inside a park. And I think the point Andy makes about putting up speed humps and ensuring that people drive more slowly in areas that are very likely to be hotspots for mortality needs to be taken very seriously.
We had lost Charles earlier. He's back on the line. Hello, Charles.
Hi, Aki. Aki, I just wanted to make a comment. I've got a farm in Midvaal near Meyerton, and I'm on the road quite a lot, and it's a perception of mine that when people hit the rural roads, it's it's a free for all on the speed. And you know, in the last 2 weeks, we've seen 2 jackals knocked down, and one of them was a youngster. And there's numerous owls that are knocked every week that we see.
Yeah, it's very sad. You know, I was going to raise the owls. I mean, I've nearly knocked an owl over. I mean, they just, you know, stop in the middle of the road. But it's very tragic, you know. When you see one of these animals, these beautiful animals of the wild, just lying dead or injured on the side of the road, your heart breaks, doesn't it, Charles?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And both those animals are needed by the farmers. You know, they're natural pest repellents, so
yeah.
they need it.
That's
just a comment I wanted to make.
Appreciate the call, Charles. Keep those calls coming in on 011 8830 702. Your SMSs as well. We'll get through to them in a moment. 31702 is our SMS line. We're talking about roadkill, and Dr. Harriet Davies Mostert is in to talk about the science and research at the Endangered Wildlife Trust. In our Going Green feature this week, and your calls will be welcome. We're going to talk about the different kinds of animals that are getting knocked down and what can be done. Maybe you have some ideas as how do you prevent roadkill. It's a very difficult one because you can't tell the animals, you know, don't come into this area. And human beings, I'm ashamed to be called a human being because we are creating these problems. But perhaps there are solutions. Perhaps you have seen something or you've read about something that's been done successfully that reduces the amount of roadkill. And you know, these rare species that are getting knocked down. So call us on 011 8830 702. 31702. We'll continue with your calls and our discussion with Dr. Harriet Davies Mostert in just a moment.